It is now my great pleasure to introduce Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dr. Ash Carter. Before he arrives here, let me just say a couple of words about Ash Carter. Known, of course, for his public service, Dr. Carter actually started his career as a physicist, earning his bachelor degree in physics and also in medieval history, a sure sign, I believe, of a wide-ranging intellect, and his doctorate in theoretical physics from Oxford, and his undergraduate work was done at Yale. I have to tell you a funny story. This has nothing to do with Dr. Carter, but I have a cousin whose mother was very proud of her daughter also going to Yale. Her mother was a woman who had a bit of a German accent, and she astonished all of her friends when she proudly told them that her daughter was now at Yale, and she was so proud. Anyway, I had the great pleasure of working with Ash Carter in the Department of Defense when he was Assistant Secretary for International Security Policy. His many talents were quickly recognized in Washington, and he rose at the first opportunity to Undersecretary and then to the position that he now holds of Deputy Secretary of Defense. He is someone often sought for advice, and the advice that he gives is logical and sympathetic, and those are attributes that are not always very popular here in Washington, but he is fairly courageous. And I have to tell you, before those assignments, Dr. Carter was chair of the International and Global Affairs faculty at the Kennedy School at Harvard as well. And of course, he's received many honors and held many other high-level appointments, such as membership in the Defense Science Board, Defense Policy Board, and even as advisor during certain times in his career to private sector institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to ask Dr. Ash Carter to come and speak.
Thank you, Walter, for that introduction. Thank you all friends of the National Defense University, which means so much to us. Secretary Kissinger, thank you, sir, for being here, all the distinguished guests. It's too late in the evening to recount all the happenings of history in which Brent Scowcroft figures. So I commend to you a shorter but useful way to appreciate Brent. And that's to reflect on all the things that did not happen, the bad things that did not happen, or how history could have been very different were it not for the cool head and the warm heart of this great man at the center of America's national security for 5 decades. The aftermath of Vietnam, for example, when America could have been plunged into a dark period of declined influence and self-confidence, but which never happened because by acting decisively in the Mayaguez incident, opening up to Mao's China, and standing resolute against Brezhnev's Soviet Union, our prestige in the world was sustained. Or the final days of the Nixon White House, and the transition to President Ford, an unprecedented achievement of our republic, precisely because nothing happened, and it could have been quite different. Or the peak years of the Cold War, when we now know from Soviet archives that we were closer to nuclear war than anyone except maybe Brent imagined, but it didn't happen. Or above all, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first ever disintegration of a nuclear power, a moment whose danger is scarce remembered now, precisely because it turned out so much better than it might have. At all these moments, Brent Scowcroft was there, and his balance, civility, and realism brought us through safely. These things could have been very different, and there are many more cases like this. And another thing that could have been very different, but for the influence of Brent Scowcroft, stands before you, me. Brent has been a mentor of mine for more than 25 years. There are many like me, too. Here's the story I want to tell. 1983, I was a young MIT physicist with no sense of a career in national security. But the Strategic Defense Initiative, or so-called Star Wars, was the issue of the day. And I was asked by Paul Nitze, who was then President Reagan's arms control advisor, to accompany a small delegation to Moscow to discuss nuclear arms, including defenses. I knew something about lasers and neutral particle beams and so forth, so Paul asked me to go as an expert. My mission was to examine a Soviet spacecraft that they claimed was a probe of a moon of Mars, but our intelligence community suspected it was a space-based laser weapon. So off we went to Moscow. Brent, me, and I remember Shai Meyer, also former Chief of Staff of the Army. The Soviets took me to their space center, where the head of their space program, Raul Sagdayev, later the husband of Susan Eisenhower, let me climb around the probe and satisfy myself that the laser aboard it could not shoot down missiles. I'll spare you the technical details. This was the Soviet Union of the old days. And Shai and I remember all of us sharing a single bar of soap that one of us had brought, since there was no soap in the hotel. What I really remember was Brent's kindness and example. I was a nobody, but he treated me as a member of the delegation, listened to me, gave me advice, and it has been thus on many trips together since to places all over the world. He probably doesn't remember this first trip, but I remember it vividly, Brent. It was when I realized that the values embodied in Brent Scowcroft existed in public life at the highest levels. He inspired me to stay involved in these matters after I returned to university, and eventually brought me to the Pentagon to serve directly or indirectly 8 secretaries of defense. So I would have been very different, but for Brent. And I'm not an isolated example. There are countless men and women, including of this generation, who will tell you that their faith in public life was strengthened by the example and values of Brent Scowcroft. These values are, and I want to quote Bob Gates in remarks he made about Brent, quote, civility, mutual respect, putting country before self and country before party, listening to and learning from one another, not pretending to have all the answers, and not demonizing those with whom we differ. Around Brent and around these values, I've therefore seen gather a group of people who include Bob Gates, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, whom I will call a solid center for this country. And every time I despair of this center dwindling here in Washington, I'm heartened to see Brent, because I know he continues to be the magnetic force that attracts people of all ages, including our NDU students, to the true foundations of the nation's security. So, as you go to sleep tonight and reflect on this evening, remember, it all could have been very different, but for Brent. Thank you all.